All right. So we're going to talk about social license to operate. And this was a concept I only found out about, or at least learned the name of, a couple of years ago. I was at an International Society for Equitation Science meeting in Australia. And Julie Fiedler was talking about this. And I'm like, oh my gosh, finally, there is some validity to my concerns that it actually matters what the public thinks about what we do with our, in this case, horses. And as I have been in Kentucky just for the last few years, I've started studying the horse racing and thoroughbred welfare issue. And from December of 2018 throughout most of 2019, Santa Anita, California was a very interesting case study for looking at this. And it sort of hit the airwaves in January and really didn't slow down until we got into 2020 with 2020's set of its own issues. And I believe that maybe Derek or Lee have shared this article with you. It should be open access through the Journal of Sustainability, Thoroughbred Racehorse Welfare, through the lens of social license to operate. The emphasis is on the thoroughbred racing horse, so it doesn't really get into our standard bred harness horses. And it's mainly a US perspective, but having said that, most of the racing in Ontario, especially with regards to Woodbine, is very similar to the US perspective. And this just gets into a little bit about some of those tracks throughout North America that have this NTRA safety and integrity accreditation. And I do think as social license gains more respect, this will be an accreditation that is more looked for. So some of the snapshots, I started having some of my undergraduate students help me collect social media information. And as they were looking for Nexus Uni, or you might have heard it called LexisNexis, you can look up how many times something like racehorse and welfare show up in news articles. And if you compare 2017, 2018, 2019, we have just this massive increase in news articles, news media that relate to racehorse and welfare. And this was what really prompted a lot of attention. 37 horse deaths that were related to some sort of catastrophic breakdown. So for a lot of different reasons, when a horse breaks a leg, it is not as easy to manage as when a human has what would otherwise be a career-ending type of injury. And we could spend an entire talk just on that topic. But we'll keep going right now with what the social media part has been. So if you look at typing in Santa Anita horse deaths, you know, massive percent of increase. It basically wasn't on the radar screen in 17 particularly. A different student looked up petition drives that were started on social media and found all these different ones that would have hundreds of thousands of signatures related to starting petitions to try to drive thinking about racehorses. And this has been one of the ways that animal advocates have done things like pretty much minimize, almost stop greyhound racing as a different example. And as we looked at this, and this is something I've kind of been tracking for a few years now, certainly catastrophic breakdowns is one of the big things, and especially the public's concern about how that maybe relates to different surfaces, whether they're running on grass, whether they're running on dirt, whether they're running on a synthetic. There is lots of chatter out there about 2-year-old horses racing. And a lot of this chatter comes from people that are fellow horse owners. The use of the whip or the crop, medication, whether it is therapeutic medication that has been used at a higher dose or more frequently than it's supposed to be, or something that would qualify as doping, where we would be looking more at an illicit substance. And we'll talk just a bit more about this Lasix issue as we go along. And then aftercare, what happens to them after they leave the track? There was an expose, I think it was last year, that took place out of Australia that prompted a lot of concern because they were able to track some of these horses through either lip tattoos or microchips and find that the really nice story about what happened to racehorses afterwards was not quite as truthful as what they had been leading people to believe. So how does social license to operate help to give us an ethical framework to consider racehorse welfare? I think it's important to go back a little bit to the concept itself. And if we think about, for example, sows and gestation crates, when I first got into the field of studying animal behavior and animal welfare, that was just very normal for sows to be in individual gestation crates. And as time has gone on, we've kind of, to a degree, lost that social license to operate for that principle. And now we're much more moving towards group housing of sows. Greyhound racing, I kind of alluded to already. Bullfighting in Spain, it used to be just a given tradition. It was part of their culture. And now we have more and more people asking questions about this. So the social license for bullfighting has created question marks. And just as an aside, they now have bullfighting, for example, where there's like a harness around the bull and they can use these like arrows with Velcro on them. So they can still do the art and the tradition without killing an animal for public sport. So imagine an intangible, unwritten, non-legally binding social contract where the community gives industry the right to conduct its business. And all aspects of the equine industry increasingly find themselves being examined through this lens. So that might be high-level dressage and the issue of real cure where the headset is really cranked in. It might be reining horses and how are they taught to do sliding stops and spins. These are under scrutiny and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I like the idea of trying to establish transparency and do what's right for the horse to start with. So as we have an intersection of public perception, transparency, legitimacy of the sport, trust between the industry and the stakeholders, these all play into this social license to operate. Rolly Owers is this really wonderful guy. He is a lovely speaker to listen to. If you get a chance, I've included the link and Derek and Lee will have access to sharing this. He gives some great talks on social license to operate and how we have to be conscientious of this if we want to continue having our equestrian sports. There's been too much time really spent just assuming because we love our horses that we're doing right by them. And as we examine things more closely, there are certainly times where we can say, ooh, I don't know if that is totally fair to horses. And one of the classes I teach is called Equine Industry Issues. And I try really hard to challenge my students to think about various parts of the industry. So not just horse racing, not just English pleasure, not just jumping, but let's try to look at this in a very multidisciplinary kind of way. Julie Fiedler, I had mentioned her earlier as somebody that worked as a co-author on the paper we did on social license to operate. She's kind of become the global expert in social license to operate as it is applied to horse sport. And she talks about a couple things like internet access on a 24/7 basis. And this being a way that it used to be a lot of times each sport was just scrutinized by people within that sport. But now if somebody does something really horrific with, I don't know, an English pleasure horse, that can be all over the internet within a matter of 1 or 2 hours. And so that's a very interesting piece to pay attention to. And I would also mention this is not always negative. I watched really closely the social media coverage of Winx, which is a really famous racing mare out of Australia. And they would show her groom taking her out to eat grass. And they would show the exercise rider riding her into the ocean. And just these little things that built up positive feelings. So back to Santa Anita, we had people get really upset about these catastrophic breakdowns. Some of these folks have been protesting horse racing for years, and they kind of saw this as their perfect opportunity to get a foothold. And people in California especially, but really throughout North America, had to stand up and take notice. It's like, okay, wait a second. We have people really concerned. So it wasn't even necessarily that Santa Anita was suddenly having more breakdowns than previous years, but the attention had been a shift. And suddenly there were people all over the world hearing about Santa Anita and breakdowns. This is a concept that's notoriously difficult to quantify. Like, it'd be lovely to just take a little litmus paper and say, okay, your social license is still really good, or your social license is getting on the border of being problematic. And it's just not straightforward like that. So we have to, I think, be proactive about our social license. And if we know there's an area of question, for example, with show horses, there are a lot of show horse barns where horses are in their stall for 23 hours per day. And from a horse's nature standpoint, that's not right. And that's a piece we should be proactive in trying to address, rather than just waiting until somebody that knows less about horses comes in and changes it for us. So as we were looking at this, I had done surveys in a couple of my classes for a few years. I also was looking at public polls, and then I had my students working on social media content theme analysis, where you read the social media comments and you try to figure out, okay, these folks are mainly concerned about this, or these folks are mainly concerned about this. And there was a group called Coalition for Horse Racing Integrity. They were asked some descriptive terms applied to the sport. 9 in 10 people that do betting on horse races feel like horse racing is closely affiliated with drugs and doping and performance enhancing drugs. Now, that wasn't necessarily enough to have them stop betting on the races, but for it to be such a high rate was definitely concerning. So getting into catastrophic breakdowns, these have a super high visual impact. And like when I was a youth and a college student, I saw maybe 2 of these catastrophic breakdowns on televised races that I watched. And I think many of us had this opinion that this is something that only happens in a rare while. When all of this Santa Anita publicity came out in 2019, suddenly the public that cared anything about horse racing kind of had to realize, oh my gosh, there are actually horses that break their leg and have to be put down every single week. And I think that was shocking to a lot of people. One thing really good and positive that the thoroughbred industry has done is in 2008, they launched the Equine Injury Database. And in a move towards transparency, they have accumulated all of this data on breakdowns that led to euthanasia. And as an example, during this 6-year time period, when they compared the synthetic track surface to the turf grass-based surface to the dirt, which is the most common, they were seeing 1.22 fatalities per 1,000 starts, 1.59 per 1,000 starts, and 2.04 per 1,000 starts. Now, on the surface, that looks like not a huge difference, but that was something like 300 horses of difference. So had all of those dirt horses, for example, run on a synthetic track in this country, we would have saved about 300 horses' lives. And every time a horse goes down, that is extraordinarily dangerous to the jockey. So we also had 300 times that jockeys' health and well-being were put at risk. And again, if we think about this social license to operate, I think we need to really look at what the evidence says in terms of these surfaces. And our evidence points strongly that we need to keep moving towards synthetic surface. Now, having said that, there are still a decent number of trainers that don't love the synthetic surface. They don't like that it tends to be a slightly slower surface. They are a little more worried about soft tissue injuries like bowed tendons. But our evidence continues to be very strong. If it is about stopping catastrophic breakdowns, synthetic is safer than dirt. And we already are seeing a switch to where we have more turf races than what we used to. So this is another one that I hear a lot from people that are in the horse industry, but not in the racing industry. They're like, oh my gosh, why do we race the babies? We shouldn't race the 2-year-olds. If we would stop that, we wouldn't have the breakdowns. And here's the thing, here's the rub. The evidence is so strong from the exercise physiology group and the bone physiologist that in terms of bone integrity, we are far better off conditioning and racing 2-year-olds than, let's say, waiting till they're 4 or 5. Because if you wait till they're 4 or 5, again, that equine injury database shows us we have far more breakdowns of those older horses, partly because you want that horse in conditioning when their bone can model and adapt to speed. They will get more bone density, more cortical bone if they have conditioning. And this has been a hard thing. I have grappled and grappled with this because if I'm dealing with jumping horses or dressage horses, I don't want them doing tons and tons of work as a 2-year-old. But again, we're sometimes dealing with mental training issues. We're sometimes dealing with soft tissue buildup. But in terms of bone integrity, again, our evidence is very, very strong that sensible conditioning and sensible racing of 2-year-olds is the right way to go. Race day medication. So the most inflammatory topic here is related to Lasix, which the basic name is furosemide, and technically the name for the horse medication is Salix. But Lasix is the term that most people throw around in the media and so forth. So this is a drug that does help horses with EIPH or horses that are bleeders. So when they do high intensity exercise, they get those little drops of blood in the respiratory system. If they're getting furosemide, we know that it does help protect them from the really bad categories of being a bleeder. However, here's another one where we go back to social license to operate. Even if we have scientific evidence that yes, Lasix helps, if the public hates the idea that a medication is used, and if much of the public thinks of all drugs in the same basket, we may have to mostly stop Lasix in order to save our social license so that we don't lose horse racing completely. And this has been an interesting one. I see more and more of the races for 2-year-olds, for example, that are running as Lasix free. Definitely a lot of races in other countries are running as Lasix free. And this 83% of Americans favor this US Anti-Doping Association, which is also in charge of other major sports. And we are moving in the direction of having them be part of our horse racing integrity. And again, this is talking about the US, but for the most part, Woodbine gets rolled into that as well. All right, whip use is a really interesting one. And if you are really enmeshed in the racing industry, you might call this crop use, or you might call it the jockey stick. I just find it's easiest to call it a whip. And especially if I'm trying to look up material in the literature, most of the literature comes out of Australia and they usually call it whip. So if you're trying to find the material, that's normally what they're going to call it. And this one has been super interesting. And maybe like 12 years ago, I was talking with Paul McGreevy, who has been one of the researchers that's done a lot of the whip studies. And I'm like, Paul, I don't think this is the biggest welfare problem the horse industry has. Why are you investing so much energy to this? And his feeling was, way before we started using this term social license to operate, he's like, the thing is, Camie, it's such a bad image thing. You know, we tell these people that horses love to race, that thoroughbreds love to run, and then they see the whip get used over and over and over and over coming down the stretch. And that seems incredibly hypocritical. And over the last few years, I have totally gotten onto that bandwagon that we probably need to allow the whip to be carried for safety, but not for encouragement. So there's these 3 legitimate uses. If you look into some of the books in Australia and Great Britain that cover whip use, they talk about using it for safety to avoid dangerous situations. Every once in a while, you'll have a horse try to blow it like the last turn. And so if they start to veer out to the right, you may need that crop to get your horse back into their lane, so to speak. And if you think about where the jockey's legs are in the horse, your legs essentially have no usefulness. I mean, yes, they're keeping you balanced there, but you can't correct a race horse with your legs. And then this is the one that I have the biggest issue with, this issue of encouragement. And you hear a lot of jockeys right now talking about how they have to be able to have a whip to encourage the horse to give their best effort. And their feeling is that's the only way to be fair to the betting public. And I would contend, and I rode and rode Arabian racehorses for about 6 years, quite a while back. My contention was once the horses were in good condition, they didn't need a whip to run hard and run fast. The ones that were any good at it at all you had to do was, you know, kind of cluck to them or smooch to them, and they were gone. I mean, they really did seem to enjoy it, other than a small number that really never wanted to be racehorses, but you figured that out very quickly. So my feeling is this whole encouragement argument by the jockeys is not quite the way to go. And it's kind of interesting to see and hear a lot of the retired jockeys coming out now and saying, yeah, guys and gals, this is not the way to go. The public doesn't like to see this. We might have to be willing to give up on this one. So it'll be super interesting to see where we're at 2 years from now. And yeah, so you've got this group talking about the whip as a necessary tool, this other group talking about the whip as an instrument of cruelty. So again, I would have no qualms with the whip being carried for steering and safety reasons. I think our stewards are well enough trained that they can watch a race replay and say, yes, that was used judiciously for an appropriate reason. But I really don't like using it for encouragement going down the stretch. I think the idea of limiting the number of strokes is a step in the right direction, but to try to assume that a jockey in the heat of the moment with that kind of adrenaline is always going to be able to keep track of the number in their head, I think that really asks an awful lot. This was one that like just super recently came out. I always forget how to pronounce her first name. Curly Thompson has been the lead author on this. Is whip use important to thoroughbred racing integrity? What stewards' reports are revealing. So they've compared a bunch of whip-free races with a bunch of whip-used races. And in terms of fairness to the bettors, punters and bettors are the same thing. They ended up showing no statistical difference. So to be honest, I only found this article a few days ago. I really need to get into it and dig through and look at the methodology. But my guess is this will carry quite a bit of weight moving forward. One last issue is aftercare. And this is one place where I think the thoroughbred industry is making a lot of progress. We are far from perfect, but in terms of helping with social license to operate, trying to retrain and rehome as many of these thoroughbreds as possible is very important to the public's perception. Every time we end up with one of these retired racehorses ending up in a kill pen to go to slaughter, even though you and I could discuss whether or not slaughter of horses is okay or not, and that would be a totally different conversation. I think the thoroughbred industry, being so much under scrutiny, really has to try very hard to be away from that plight. So collectively, these aftercare organizations that we've been able to track have helped rehome at least 30,000 retired thoroughbreds, but we have so much more of a job to do yet. The average full crop is about 20,000 thoroughbreds per year as far as US and Canada. And so we really need to be thinking, all right, the ones that are not of the right caliber to go into a breeding program, what are we going to do with a retired gelding, let's say, or a retired mare that shouldn't probably be having foals? So I wanted to make sure to leave time for questions. And I always just think this is kind of fun. More Than Ready is a pretty well-known sire here in the Kentucky area. And so last year he had one of his sons, Catholic boy, earn 2.1 million. And then this is my daughter's More Than Ready horse, who won absolutely $0. So it continues to be a big gamble, but one that a lot of us really, really enjoy. So we need to try to maintain that social license to operate as well as we possibly can. All right, thanks, gang.